Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today and for agreeing to our request to obtain documents as part of this investigation and for calling the person who has not been mentioned yet, Governor Snyder, to testify on Thursday. Some people in your position might have shied away from this investigation, but you came through on your promises, and I thank you for that. I also want to thank you for agreeing to our request to conduct transcribed interviews of key witnesses. Last week, our staff traveled to Michigan to interview Dan Wyant, the former director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. He, too, has not been mentioned yet. Mr. Wyant resigned on December the 29th. The same day, the Governor's Task Force issued its damning report, the Governor's Task Force. According to that report, Mr. Wyant's staff told officials in Flint that corrosion control treatment was, and I quote, not necessary. So Mr. Wyant said that. Mr. Wyant's staff also misinterpreted the Federal lead and copper rule, and their failures, and I quote, and this comes from the Governor's Task Force now, quote, led directly to the contamination of the Flint water system, end of quote. Again, this is all according to the Governor's own task force. Mr. Wyant was a very difficult witness who evaded many of our questions. Last December, he apologized to the people of Flint, but he was not remorseful or apologetic in his interview with the committee. In fact, he disputed almost everything the Governor's Task Force concluded about his failures. Despite this obstruction, Mr. Wyant did tell us an interesting fact, and this was very, very interesting. He said in all the time he served as director, and despite all of the public outrage about the state's inaction, the topic of Flint water was never raised in any cabinet meeting. Not by Mr. Wyant, not by the governor, and not by anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, there's something wrong with that picture. That was all the way through December of last year. I don't know if this is accurate, but if it's so, it's absolutely astonishing. In addition to interviewing Mr. Wyant, our staff also interviewed one of Governor Snyder's emergency managers for Flint, Jerry Ambrose. The state law that Governor Snyder championed in 2011 gave him authority to basically disenfranchise local officials, overrule their votes, and appoint his own emergency managers with complete power over the decisions of the city's decision-making. City employees were required to obey their orders. During his interview, Mr. Ambrose told us that his number one priority, and the top priority of all of the governor's emergency managers was to cut spending. Cut spending. Everything else was viewed through the lens of a cost-cutting, and public health and safety clearly suffered as a result. This is why in March of 2015, when the Flint City Council voted to reconnect to clean drinking water from Detroit, Mr. Ambrose used his power to overrule their vote. He thought it was too expensive, and it was cheaper to keep using corrosive water from the Flint River. Something is wrong with that picture. even though the state of Michigan had major budget surpluses. And Mr. Ambrose told us that he never once, not once, asked for funds to help Flint switch back to clean drinking water from Detroit. Mr. Chairman, our investigation is not complete. We have another interview coming up with Edward Kurtz, the governor's second emergency manager in Flint. And there are key questions he needs to answer. For example, there was a general agreement that the shifting from Detroit water to the new pipeline being built by the Karangandi Water Authority, or KWA, could save money. But the KWA pipeline was still under construction, and there was going to be a gap of about 2 years. Genesee County chose to stay on Detroit water during this period. But Mr. Kurtz hired an engineering firm to use the Flint water as the primary source of drinking water. We have yet to see any detailed studies before this switch analyzing what would need to be done to ensure that the water coming out of the taps would be safe and how much that might cost. Where are the analyses? Where are the documents? We have not seen them. Finally, we have heard Republicans focus their criticism almost extensively and exclusively on the EPA. I agree. The EPA officials could have done more. And I agree that everyone at fault must be held accountable. If you'll recall, Mr. Chairman, when you asked me about bringing the head of the EPA, I said bring every single person that might have anything to do with this. I'm not trying to protect anybody except the people of Flint. But under federal law and regulations, states have the primary responsibility to enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act. In this case, Michigan officials displayed, and I quote, an abysmal public response. That's according to the governor's task force. I didn't say that. The governor's task force said that. Their actions were, quote, and again, the governor's task force, quote, simply insufficient to the task of public protection, end of quote. Again, those are not my words. They are the words of the governor's task force. And the task force concluded with this, as I close, and I quote. They said, we believe that the primary responsibility for what happened in Flint rests with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, end of quote. And so we will continue our investigation. There are 15 people that we tried, that Congresswoman Lawrence and I asked that we meet with and have conduct interviews of. None of them would cooperate. And so we still have work to do. And again, Mr. Chairman, I mean it sincerely. I thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for holding the hearing on February 3rd, today, and the one coming up on Thursday.